All right, hello. Welcome back to EAS Britannia, everybody. Now today, I've decided to do something a little different. Okay, so EAS content will still be the absolute core of everything I do on this channel, but I also want to occasionally create a few different types of videos. That'll still be focused around different scenarios, so nuclear war, alien invasion, zombie apocalypse, the usual apocalypse and end of the world scenarios we all know and love in the EAS community. But I want to take them a little further and in a different direction. I want them to be more lore-based, so when people discuss these topics or make EAS videos around these topics, they focus on the build-up, the politics of the world and all that jazz, and it leads to a climax where the chosen event happens. And then that's that, it's done, the video's finished. But for me, especially with a lot of these EAS scenarios being rooted in a lot of realism, I've always personally wondered what happens afterwards. What is the state of civilization after the cataclysm, after government falls and 99% of the population is wiped out? What happens then? We almost never find out, and it's always seemingly left to interpretation, to take it wherever you want it to go, but hardly ever do we get a scenario set as the event is happening and that focuses on the aftermath and years after the event. In my mind, the big example of this is the Fallout series, where you explore the world post-nuclear war, but even then, a lot of the events are extremely fantastical and are to be taken with a mountain of salt, and I get that, it's a game, it's a story, and it has to be engaging to the audience, and that's fine. But something like nuclear war is a real possibility in our lifetimes. And so I do believe that there should be an active exploration of what the world would be like for those who survive it, who have to live on after the button is pressed. And so that's the kind of thing I'm going to explore in these types of videos. Now, as I said previously, I will still focus entirely on creating engaging EAS scenarios because they can be taken in any direction, whether you like or dislike the ideas, it's fine. We all have a different view of what a certain topic should look like. But as I said earlier, I am going to start a separate series based upon the premise of apocalyptic aftermaths. Now, before we get into that, I am looking to expand this channel, so any kind of interaction would be massively appreciated. Please like, subscribe if you're interested in these videos, and comment what you think, ideas you'd want me to discuss, or scenarios you want to see in EAS videos. Now, firstly, this channel is called EAS Britannia. That's because I'm a proud Brit, and what I see in the media and on a lot of EAS videos is mainly USA-based content. And that's absolutely fine because they're still really engaging and they're really good, really gripping, and the people have a very, very deep knowledge of the country that they're setting it in and the infrastructure of the country they're setting it in. But for me, I've decided to primarily focus my scenarios in the UK, hence why I use the BBC, for example, as a lot of the news broadcasts in my videos. I find it easier to ground my stories in reality that way because I know a lot of the places I set the stories, and so I'm going to be able to justify a realistic prediction and interpretation of what would happen in that situation. And so I'm going to do the same with my Aftermath series. I'm going to focus on the state of the UK post certain apocalyptic scenarios and try my best to create a world which is grounded in as much reality as possible while still holding on to that core premise of entertainment. Of course, no one really knows exactly what the world would be like after an apocalyptic scenario, but because of that, there is huge room for interpretation as well as speculation, and so that is where this series comes in. I'm gonna do my absolute best to make these as detailed as possible with timelines and dates, popular population numbers, different changing aspects of civilization, post-apocalypse, to really try and make this a realistic but entertaining project that could be built upon with many videos. That being said, I have yapped for a good few minutes already, so it's time to get into the first aftermath of this series. That is going to be a nuclear war. to start with, a little bit of background is needed to be explained and set. Okay, so the UK is a nuclear-armed power, as we all know, with an estimated 225 to 260 nuclear weapons. These are solely fired from 4 Trident nuclear submarines, which are HMS Vanguard, Vengeance, Victorious, and Vigilant. And of the 4, one is always at sea. So the UK possesses a permanent strike capability against any target. The power play of this strategy means that Britain could realistically strike anywhere in the world by positioning its subs within firing range of the enemy nation. So Britain can theoretically strike any and all nations on Earth with nuclear weapons. However, this also makes Britain a target, and being one of the key members of the NATO alliance, and being perfectly placed on the edge of the European continent, also provides a tactical advantage for NATO, specifically the United States. Meaning if a nuclear war was to break out, the UK would be a primary target for a nuclear-armed adversary of Great Britain and of NATO. Now, 5 major NATO sites exist within the UK. These are the Northwood Headquarters, which houses the Allied Maritime Command, Injun Barracks, home to NATO's Allied Rapid Reaction Corps, RAF Molesworth, crucial for defence intelligence, Blandford Camp, which hosts a deployed communication module, and RAF Yeovilton, which hosts the NATO Joint Electronic Warfare Corps staff. There are also 13 bases in the UK where American personnel operate out of. These are the RAF bases of Lakenheath, Crowton, Welford, Fairford, Feltwell, Upwood, Barford St John, Blenheim Crescent, Fylingdales, Menwith Hill, Mildenhall, Alconbury, and once again RAF Molesworth. And as you can see here from this image taken from the campaign of nuclear disarmament, these positions are spread across the length and breadth of England. When talking actual critical British bases, they include the Royal Navy bases of HMMB Portsmouth, which is the largest Royal Navy base in the UK and home to the majority of the surface fleet, HMMB Devonport, located in Plymouth, which is the largest naval base in Western Europe, HMMB Clyde in Fastlane, Scotland, which is the host to the UK's submarine fleet, including the Trident nuclear deterrent subs, BRNC Dartmouth, the Royal Navy's officer training establishment, CTCRM Limpstone, the main training centre for the Royal Marines, and the RNAF Caldrose base, a significant base for the Royal Navy's maritime Merlins. For the Royal Air Force, major stations include RAF Brize Norton, RAF Lossiemouth, which is home to Typhoon fighter jets and maritime patrol aircraft, RAF Marham base for the F-35 Lightning jets, as well as home to the Voyager air-to-air refueling and transport aircraft, RAF Coningsby, home to more Typhoon fighter jets, and RAF Waddington, a key intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance aircraft base. Major army garrisons include the Catterick Garrison, the largest British Army garrison in the world, located in North Yorkshire, Tidworth, Neverhaven, and Bulford Garrison, a collection of barracks and facilities in Wiltshire, and Aldershot Garrison, Hampshire, historically known as the home of the British Army. Finally, the British Special Forces, with the SAS having bases in Stirling Lines, Creedon Hill, Hereford, the main base and headquarters for the 22nd SAS Regiment, Regent's Park Barracks in London, housing the 21st Special Air Service Regiment, and Birmingham, housing the 23rd Special Air Service Regiment. The SBS, the Special Boat Service, is thought to be solely based in Hamworthy Barracks Pool, Dorset. These locations are major targets, with them housing the bulk of the British armies, navies, and Air Force, as well as major command centres of NATO personnel in the UK, the majority being American. Now, for this scenario to develop, we need to throw some theoretical escalations into the mix. And so the scenario I'm going to run with here is one that has often been mentioned by the government of the UK over the past 6 months or so, which is the deployment of British troops in Ukraine. Now, this is absolutely not a political video. Anything I say in this video is to be taken as a developmental asset, so to speak, for the advancement of the story. I'm not going to go in depth into why they're deployed. Let's just say the US pulls funding for the defense of Ukraine, and so European nations, mainly Britain and Germany, let's say, try to fill the gap by deploying their own soldiers. The worst comes to pass, and within days, British and German troops are engaging in firefights with Russian troops on the front lines. Over the next 2 weeks, the conflict escalates, the wider NATO alliance joins, the war stalemates after a month, and so Russia begins using tactical nuclear weapons on troop concentrations across the front line. This brings a NATO nuclear response, and the dominoes begin to fall rapidly. Before long, let's say September 1st, 2025, Russia launches its nuclear arsenal towards the United Kingdom. This is where the scenario truly begins. So let's firstly calculate the amount of nuclear weapons fired at the United Kingdom. Russia's total nuclear arsenal is largely speculative, although it is believed to be around 5,500. Of these, around 1,200 are retired and awaiting dismantlement, so let's knock 1,200 off. Now we're around 4,300. Of these, around 1,700 are currently deployed on different delivery systems, various missiles, submarines and bombers, and so 2,600 nuclear weapons aren't deployable instantly, but could be made deployable over time. So the war escalates and the nukes launch. Given the sheer amount of NATO nations that Russia would look to strike, I believe it largely likely that the USA would be the primary target for the most strikes. However, Germany and the UK would also trail behind the USA. With the numbers broken down, I think it is likely that Russia would go strike for strike with the United Kingdom. So let's take the number 250 as an acceptable number of nuclear weapons the UK has. Let's say this entire arsenal is deployed against Russia, the sole enemy in this conflict. Whether that be against troop concentrations, cities, infrastructure, military bases, it doesn't matter, they are all fired at Russia. Therefore, Russia also fires 250 at the UK. Now, first of all, the UK compared to Russia is absolutely tiny. Landmass size, there's no comparison. In fact, Russia is around 70 times bigger by landmass than the United Kingdom. And so those 250 spreading across Russia will be far less devastating than they would be the 250 striking the smaller, much smaller UK. So let's break down this strike targets. 60 to 80 of the 250 would be tactical weapons, aimed at all different types of barracks, bases and centers mentioned previously in this video, as well as many smaller but important installations littered across the nation. Some would be struck more than once, for example the HMMB Clyde, due to its association with the nuclear Trident submarines. That would almost likely be struck at least twice. So let's take that middle number of 70 nukes detonate across the UK. So now there's 180 nuclear strikes occurring across the rest of the UK. One major target would be the airports of the United Kingdom. There are over 40 commercial airports in the UK, with major ones including the London airports of Heathrow, Gatwick, Stansted, Luton and London City. Other major airports will include Manchester, Edinburgh, Birmingham, Glasgow, Bristol, Newcastle, Liverpool John Lennon and Belfast International. I believe that at least half of the 40 would be struck to limit any kind of airborne response by the British government, whether that be commandeering flight companies such as British Airways to aid troops fighting, or to evacuate civilians from certain areas. So there's another 20. There are 160 left, and now comes the most brutal part. There are 76 cities in the UK. Every single one would be struck by some form of nuclear weapon. Every single one, some more than once. I can see 120 to 130 of the remaining nuclear warheads being targeted towards cities in a mutually assured destruction scenario. Now we'll get on to casualties later, but this is the death blow of the civilization in the UK. With around 30 nuclear weapons left to hit Britain, certain transport hubs, manufacturing bases, and industrial areas would be targeted. Some rural areas may also be struck in a brutal show of merciless nature of nuclear war. But by the time all 250 have struck, the United Kingdom ceases to exist as a functioning society. It's now the hour of impact. 11 AM, September 1st, 2025. And this is when the first nuclear warheads hit the United Kingdom. London is hit first, with a cluster of nuclear warheads. Each 5 airports I mentioned previously are struck, as well as 3 different warheads ground bursting in London. The airports are struck first, one by one getting hit with 500 kiloton warheads. The fallout from these strikes begin to spread across the south of England, further poisoning the population with deadly radiation. This is before the main city of London has been struck. That attack comes now. 3 nuclear warheads slam into London and the surrounding area. First, a 750 kiloton intercontinental ballistic missile ground bursts in Fulham. Then an 800 kiloton explosion rocks Wandsworth, before Westminster is destroyed by a 1 megaton nuclear bomb. This cluster attack on the nation's capital is the first strike, and it is absolutely devastating. 3 million deaths occur within minutes. 5 million deadly injuries are sustained in the surrounding areas, whilst nuclear fallout drifts across most of the southeast of England and into the North Sea. This is just the first attack. Then come the tactical strikes on RAF bases, Royal Navy bases, Army and Special Forces bases, as well as the 5 NATO bases in the UK. First, the NATO bases, and the 13 bases housing American military personnel. All of them are hit with 100 kiloton bombs, wiping each installation out. 200,000 deaths occur instantly, 400,000 casualties ensue. However, these are ground burst weapons the Russians are using. Because of the sheer detonation of them and the sheer number of them, much of eastern England would eventually be coated in radioactive fallout just from these attacks, with much of it reaching continental Europe. This is just 26 detonations so far. 224 to go. Next come the strikes on the remaining major RAF bases, with 70,000 deaths, 140,000 injuries, and millions facing fallout in the surrounding areas. Onto the naval bases, all hit, and in total, 267,000 deaths occur instantly, with 455,000 casualties. More impactful, these strikes spread fallout far and wide, with up to 4 million being exposed across the nation. Army bases come next, with the deaths of those totaling 361,000 and 700,000 injured, with another 5 million in the surrounding areas exposed to fallout. Lastly, before the final killer blow hits, all remaining major airports across the United Kingdom are struck, causing 530,000 deaths, 965,000 injuries, with fallout now spreading across almost all of mainland Britain and Northern Ireland. Now this is the opening salvo, and it's just the beginning. but the total casualties already are 4,428,000 dead instantly, with 7,660,000 injured from the blasts, and tens of millions across the UK exposed to fallout. And now the main event starts. Firstly, the 10 most populous cities in the UK will be hit twice. Once with a 600 kiloton bomb, and then with a 400 kiloton bomb. These cities are London, once again, Birmingham, Manchester, Leeds, Glasgow, Southampton, Liverpool, Newcastle, Nottingham, and Sheffield. The first 600 kiloton bombs strike, and across these cities, the casualties hit 5 million deaths instantly, with around 9 million injuries. But fallout is even worse, hitting up to 25 million people and rendering large swathes of the nation completely poisoned. This is before the second bombs hit. As they do, a slightly smaller 400 kiloton nuke hits, causing 2 million more deaths and 2 million more injuries. Now we move on to the remaining cities in the UK, all getting hit by a 250 kiloton bomb, which causes a total of 4 million deaths with 8 million injuries. And then for certain cities, a repeat strike will hit, causing another 1 million deaths and 2 million casualties. A remaining 20 to 30 nuclear weapons are detonated across the United Kingdom, hitting transport hubs, industrial centres and more, causing another 2 million deaths and 6 million injuries. The strikes have now stopped, and the total damage can be calculated. The country lies in complete ruin. Almost no infrastructure is left standing. Only small pockets of the land still breathe clean air, and they will soon be blanketed in both radiation and the fallout from a global nuclear winter that is developing fast. The vast majority of the United Kingdom buzzes and pulses with radiation spread on the wind to every corner of the nation, and it's now the total death count can be tallied from the strikes. Across the United Kingdom, 18,428,000 people lie dead, singed in the blasts. Some melted into molten slag, others now purely radiated shadows etched into walls and pathways. Men, women, and children alike lay burned and disfigured. There is almost nowhere across the horizon where you can't make out a body or two. Behind the fallen come the injured, with 34,660,000 dying and severely injured people who now have to live and suffer through the aftermath of the strikes. Pre-war, there were 68,350,000 people in the UK. Just under 27% of those are now dead within moments. That means 50,078,000 still live, but of those, 69.2% are severely injured from the blasts, with many still to die. And this is just on the day of the strikes, within an hour, within minutes of the first strikes hitting into England, Wales, Scotland, and Northern Ireland. In the first hour post-strikes, the country is entirely in shock. Those caught in the blasts but surviving start to really experience the pain of their injuries. Many have skin and hair burned away, some have severely broken bones, missing limbs, and many are blind, deaf, or both. Anyone outside during the strikes is doomed to fall victim to intensely painful radiation sickness and eventually death. As the mushroom clouds blaze across the skies, the final shockwaves from the blast settle, and there is almost nothing left standing for the waves to destroy. All glass is shattered, most buildings are collapsed or severely damaged, and fires begin to rage uncontrollably across the nation, growing into intense infernos in the remains of major cities like London. EMPs were triggered as a result of the nuclear strikes, knocking the large majority of electrics out across the entirety of the United Kingdom, meaning any remaining medical staff in hospitals have to operate the old-fashioned way, so to speak. The EMP effects also knock out most vehicles, meaning roads are cluttered with dead and burning cars. Thick but invisible blankets of fallout begin to drape the nation, surviving emergency responders who venture out to attempt to help people sentence themselves to death, exposing themselves to such a large amount of radiation in the atmosphere. Many know the risks, and instead decide to save themselves, remaining in whatever shelter they reside in until the fallout has dissipated. All sources of water have either stopped or been contaminated, and as an hour passes since the destruction began, the skies are already beginning to cloud over. But this isn't ordinary cloud. It's thick, black, soot-filled clumps. The early stages of a nuclear winter have begun. Over the first 24 hours, deaths pile up and up. Many already begin succumbing to radiation, others to horrific injuries thanks to the blasts. Many survivors begin fighting with each other over contaminated water bottles and food, not realizing that emerging from their shelters has doomed them already in the long run. A thick, oozing rain begins to fall to the ground, only dragging more and more contaminated dirt and dust back to Earth. The fires continue to rage, spreading into forests and fields, making air horrifically thick and choking to anyone around. The lack of observation of nuclear power stations as well as chemical plants causes biological contamination of the nation, as well as more man-made radiation to leak from the plants, further poisoning the land. Animals die in their droves, with desperate, dying scavengers picking their radioactive corpses for food. All the while the temperature is already beginning to drop. Areas begin to flood as sewage systems and dams stop working. Water pipes burst, spraying contaminated liquid across the country. PTSD has already begun to set in across the population, with many having manic episodes at the sheer quickness that their world has disintegrated. Many begin taking their own lives, whilst the sick and dying further succumb to the strikes. The United Kingdom's population now sits at 25,120,000. 64.4% of the pre-war population are dead within 24 hours. Let's skip forward another day. 48 hours after the strikes hit. Fallout has coated every corner of the UK now. Unless you're lucky enough to be in a remote bunker network, you're highly likely to be exposed to deadly levels of radiation. No formal structure of any kind of government, emergency services, or military still exists. It's all collapsed. Members of these different groups survive here and there, but they would have long since abandoned their original calling, resorting back to their primal instinct to both survive and protect their loved ones. No help is coming. Ever. This isn't an earthquake or a tsunami, a natural disaster that is absolutely horrifying, but society can survive them, and foreign aid can help you back to your feet. That isn't happening here. Everywhere has been turned to ash. No help, no aid, no comfort. This is the new reality for remaining survivors, human and animal alike. With societal breakdown, the nation begins to stink. Rotten waste lingers everywhere, never to be tidied or removed. Surviving radioactive rats scurry through the rubbish, spreading illness and disease amongst an already sick and dying population. The smell is as thick as the air, full of putrid stench of rotting bodies, food and waste. Again, a reality survivors will have to get used to. Many tried to flee into the rural fields and hills as the bombs started dropping. But with the wind spreading fallout everywhere, those fields aren't any kind of solace. The prospect of growing your own food in these fields for now is completely gone, poisoned. Livestock have long since died, and their corpses rot away once more. Wells are also now becoming contaminated. Little to no clean water exists anywhere on the Isle. And when I mention survivors, even in those bunkers, eventually they'll have to expose themselves to the elements, and then they become on the clock of death, like almost everyone else. There is no safe zone, just scale of where might kill you less quickly than others. That is the sole luxury in this land now. Of those still alive, they vomit profusely and bleed from any and all openings in their body. Many, like I said previously, are blind and deaf, now only a radioactive shell of their former selves, waiting to finally die. Most survivors begin losing hair across their bodies, as well as dealing with their skin coated in burns and infected wounds no treatment can stop. Sepsis kicks in rapidly across the nation, many dying from the smallest cuts. Diarrhea wreaks havoc on the survivors, leading to wide-scale mass dehydration and even more death. There is no morphine, no paracetamol, no medicine, no sterile gauze or bandage to heal the wounds on show. They stick out like grotesque tattoos imprinted by the war. The psychological effects are devastating on the population. Many have to sit and watch their parents, children, husbands, wives, brothers and sisters wither and die agonizing deaths in front of their own eyes, knowing they can do nothing to help, but are likely to suffer the same fate. Survivor's guilt begins to creep in, with many feeling cursed to still be alive, wandering around in this hellscape. The mental state of many is completely shot, with humans screaming at nothing. An example of the manic state the human brain is now in. Between the 48 and 72-hour mark, another milestone is passed. The majority of the nation are dead by this point. Another 20 million have passed. Around 5 million people populate the ruins of the UK within 3 days of the bombs dropping. Around 1 million of these are those either prepped for such an event, had bunkers, or were in the most remote locations where although still exposed to radiation could minimize its impact, and for the large part, attempt to ride out the storm. 4 million still wander around the land, dying, injured, and broken. Despite the agony of life now, early signs of groups begin to form amongst survivors. Regardless of how desolate the environment is, humans are social creatures. We long to be around others. Many would band together with any and all people they find. This could be good or bad. In the best case scenario, small groups begin to form some sort of fortified haven to at least survive the rest of their short existence in as much comfort as possible. Whilst others become depraved torture centers. with severely sick and twisted survivors taking this opportunity to enact their desires on helpless people without legal repercussions. Children left alone in this world will not have a good experience at all. Those surviving whilst pregnant face the real possibility of stillbirth, or severely radiated and deformed children. Pregnancy may prove to be a death sentence to many surviving women, whilst many men suffer with a radiation-induced infertility. The next generation, if there is one, will be very few in numbers, possibly chronically ill and extremely at risk of the world they will inherit. The sky, by this point, is a permanent grey. Day and night cycles switch between dark cloud and slightly less dark cloud, but visibility is almost always extremely low. Fires still rage, ash still drifts, and the landscape is still barren. It would remain this way for the next 2 weeks. That's when the fallout would begin to subside. Not totally, but just slightly, making some areas traversable enough for survivors. This is now the beginning of the new life for the surviving members of the United Kingdom. Within that 2-week period, those 4 million sick, injured, and radiation-exposed people now perish in numerous horrific ways, leaving the grand total of 1 million damaged but alive survivors in the ruins of the island. They are now forced to find a way to live amongst the dead carcass of Great Britain. And now we enter what I like to call the Dead Age. You see, many see nuclear war as the end game, death blow to our species. They think we'll wipe ourselves out, but this is highly unlikely. One thing about humanity is that we are gritty, we are tough, we are survivors. The modern age has no doubt made the majority of the world weak in a sense, too reliant on technology and comforts. If that all came crashing down, almost no one would be prepared for it. And if you think you would, the odds are you're probably fooling yourself. Those who survive in this world would have to have a level of plot armor that Jon Snow from Game of Thrones would cringe at. You would have to be in the right place at the right time, all the time. You would have to avoid lethal doses of radiation in a land completely swamped by radiation. You would have to avoid feral animals now set to kill you as they are reset to their simplest primal functions. You would have to find a clean water source permanently, a non-perishing source of food, a safe place to sleep, access to gas masks to deal with the ash-filled air. You'd have to have a layer upon layer of undamaged clothing to deal with the frigid temperatures of a nuclear winter. You'd have to be heartless enough to kill without remorse in order to save yourself, and also have the ability to allow yourself to be exploited by bigger, stronger groups of people when the odds of surviving conflict with them are impossible. And even then, a small cut from rusty metal on your leg as you're scraping through a wreckage will kill you. This world is hell. It's a living hell. And for the first few years, almost nothing grows, meaning old, spoiled food would be eaten, as well as dead animals, plants, and even dead humans in the most extreme circumstance. Cannibalism would 100% become a practice across the wastelands of Earth. Not just cannibalism, but a depraved, almost sacrificial form of cannibalism. These people wouldn't always be targeting dead bodies. dead bodies rot and go off, especially in this world. If you're alive, you're a food source to some. Let's remember, there is now no electricity in 99% of Britain. Some rare bunkers and buildings may miraculously have power still, but these are few and far between. I'm now going to skim over the next few years, focusing on several major developments in this time, but largely glossing over a lot because it's all what has been repeated previously. The first months see survivors clamber out of their wreckages of their shelters to see a truly destroyed world. Everything is gone. There's no greenery anymore. Mother Nature has long since abandoned our family, leaving us orphaned on our dead island. Many simply cannot cope or handle the stresses of having to survive in this world, and as well as little to no birth rates, those who die creep the population closer and closer to zero. Our greatest buildings and structures' last walls and rooms crumble away and fade to dust, forcing survivors to build anew with wrecked, broken materials. We resort to wooden shacks, scavenged tent cities, cardboard shelters, makeshift plastic forts. Anything that could shelter us as a species is constructed from the wreckage, but nothing is of any quality. They all last minimal amounts of time, crumbling away like everything else. Catching and eating bugs, flies, and insects becomes a pastime for all of humanity. After all, they're edible. Occasionally, out of everything, the numbers of these crawling, flying masses have increased. Rudimentary disinfectant is scavenged in form of vodka and alcoholic drinks concealed in underground cellars, while some gas canisters survive the fall and grant some basic fire and light until they inevitably blow up. Broken bones were almost never reset, leaving many with crippling pain in damaged limbs or misshapen limbs too weak to put weight on. The occasional remaining military man provides survivors with a source of leadership, although some use this to form sick harems, exerting power over others for protection. Again, these groups aren't sustainable and collapse into nothing. Some of the more stable leaders who still have a glimpse of hope within them are consumed by predatory groups of people looking to take power for themselves. The immediate attempts to re-establish some form of society fail almost everywhere. Although in tiny enclaves across the nation, the foundations and building blocks do begin to be laid by bands of those stable enough with the knowledge to sustain the group long term. There is still a small glimmer of hope within the darkness of the ashes of Great Britain. However, if we speed forward now to the first decade passing, we come to an extremely uncomfortable reality. The dream of rebuilding Britain seems a long way away, and maintained by a few survivors from before the collapse. Many have already forgotten the old world, living in the current moment, only aiming for survival. It's September 1st, 2035. 10 years after the UK is obliterated by nuclear fire. The population is around 300,000, 0.4% of the pre-war population. Or to put it simply, 99.6% of the modern UK population is now dead. The radiation proved to be the main issue for civilization, stunting the reproduction of healthy children. From the sterility amongst the population to the stillborn babies or mass waves of miscarriages, humanity's numbers just seem to decrease and decrease. Even in the safe zones, with the spread of radiation, It'll be in the soil, food, water, even in miniature doses. Maternal practices such as breastfeeding could poison children due to mothers accumulating radionuclides through their lives. There is absolutely no prenatal care, no intensive care set up for children who are ill or for struggling mothers. Women will also be severely malnourished, meaning the children will also be weak and underdeveloped. Infant mortality rates would be way over 50%, and for those who survive, chronic illness, mental conditions, short lives, and a relatively horrendous existence awaits for a majority of them. But of course, not all. Major diseases like tuberculosis, cholera, and typhus all begin appearing in large numbers, and with the lack of real sanitation, they go hugely unchecked, ripping through the vulnerable. Many areas now linger unpopulated. Major cities are still mostly radioactive death traps, being ground zero to some of the most powerful bombs. Some small villages and towns may have begun to be rebuilt or established, but in extremely low numbers and nowhere near productive enough to sustain more than a few hundred apiece. Money is now a thing of the past. In fact, scavenged pre-war supplies and equipment becomes the main source of currency, trading goods and services between groups. Unfortunately, a lot of women and, even worse, children lose their standing with some of these savage men. And so to some twisted, predatory individuals, certain services become a form of payment between the two, leading to mass outbreaks and deaths from venereal diseases. Communication is extremely rare between survivor groups, with the odd shortwave radio in existence here and there, but not available on a wide scale. Stories become the main form of entertainment once more, with tales of the old world becoming more and more mythologized, only 10 years since its existence. Interestingly, some of the major religions cling on in certain areas, although as the years go by, their interpretations would begin to change. Christianity begins to once again take a hold of the population, flooding the once more primitive people of the UK with a hope that although life is hell, heaven waits beyond. Old manuals and instructions become the foundation of a new wave of proto-engineers who begin planning the basic designs of rudimentary farming equipment and water purification technology, although much of it fails due to the fractured nature of the information still available. By this point, nature has returned, and greenery is once again appearing across the land. The skies aren't parting yet though. Some cracks in the clouds are, however, beginning to show. The untouched, radioactive cities become swamped with weeds and vines, nature reclaiming them on a huge scale, while the population of wild dogs, wolves, foxes, and more begin to slowly increase. The children who did survive the births post-war are mostly stunted, mentally disabled and physically handicapped, many of them not able to speak or to an acceptable level. Some are luckily born with little to no impact committed upon them from the radiation, although they are rare. And even those have trouble learning our version of English. They begin to adopt a slang-heavy version, with new words created, letters dropped and phrases completely butchered. Understandable to those of us who would have survived the war with them due to their presence around us. But if talking to someone before the war, of a sentence of 10 words, 5 would be understandable. The other 5, complete gibberish. Another decade passes, and thus we find ourselves in 2045. 20 years since the bombs dropped, since the event now known as the Fall. There are generations of children who now never knew the world beforehand, and due to the changing times, some of these even have their own children by now. By this point, a small population growth will be seen, although hardly drastic. We're talking a jump from 300,000 to 350,000. Mortality rates amongst children are still high, but more and more are being born into a world with less and less exposure to radiation. At this point, some sources of clean water have finally been developed, and thus makeshift settlements begin to be formed around the water, mostly from very deep wells. The clouds have cleared slightly more now, although the temperature still remains colder than pre-war, and extremely unpredictable weather patterns continue. Another problem does now begin to emerge. The atmosphere's ozone layer was ravaged during the war, and so exposure to the sunlight would hit us with extremely dangerous levels of ultraviolet radiation, leading to new spikes in skin cancer, spikes in sight problems such as cataracts, as well as immune system suppression, making fighting infections and diseases much harder for the body. The stigma around the deformities from the radiation seems to largely have disappeared now, with many showing the physical signs of damage. Those without deformities, however, become lusted over, seen as a healthy partner amongst women for their future children, and therefore leaders in settlements are largely those physically unaffected by the radiation. By this time, separate groups all around the UK would have begun to form, the majority of these completely unaware of the existence of the others, apart from those within travelling or trading distance. Stories will, however, bounce between the settlements of those in far-flung places, passed on by traders who have dealt with groups who've seen other settlements, who have traded with even further away settlements. Some would even encounter foreign emissaries. The age of communication may just be starting once again. Let's now explore who these groups could actually be. The Highlanders. Hardy Scottish survivors of the Bonds and their descendants, they inhabit the rough territory of the tip of Scotland along with the Hebrides. Although initial radiation did drift upwards from Glasgow and Edinburgh, as well as from Lossiemouth, they remained relatively safe, sheltering inside natural caves and on top of peaks, as well as the relative safety of the isles off of the Scottish mainland. A rural and agricultural civilization, the Highlanders possessed some of the remaining sheep in Britain, and held together a standard of living roughly similar to that of pre-war conditions, although without the technology. Massively self-sufficient, they trade mainly seafood and wool, with venturing traders who reach into their territory. Although not an aggressive people, they can and will defend themselves if deemed necessary. Ironically, the Scottish Highlands has preserved the English language a lot better than much of mainland England, with Scots Gaelic also making a big comeback amongst survivors. A relatively moral society in an extremely picturesque part of the world. In a hell like the UK, this is one of the better places to be. The Cairngorms Union. Centred around the Cairngorms National Park in Scotland, the Cairngorms Union is a group of different settlements around Ben Macdui Mountain, which was used for safety in the aftermath of the fall. Another hardy group, they scavenge far and wide across Scotland and hold significant sway, with one of their main camps being in the ruins of Balmoral Castle, the former royal residence. With lochs, rivers and fields all around them, it is another example of Scottish serenity in this world. However, it is plagued by drifting radiation still to this day, with the bombing of Dundee to the south, Aberdeen to the east, and Inverness to the north, trapping them in a pincer movement where the only real method of travel is west, leading them straight into Highlander territory. Some skirmishes have happened, but the two groups remain on relatively cordial terms, trading food and supplies relatively often. Some do, however, decide to venture into Highland territory and south from it, to explore and seek new lands. Many of these are never heard from again. The Whiteley Borderlands. The Whiteley Borderlands is an interesting territory. Formed by a group of English citizens fleeing north and Scottish citizens fleeing south, they created a steady alliance along the border of the nations, eventually forming into a defensive and offensive alliance. Inhabiting the many hills and glens of the area, the Whiteleys don't just farm but hunt. They possess the remnants of automatic weaponry, as well as knives and makeshift spears. They're also known to be quite aggressive due to the constant raids upon their land in the first years after the collapse. A steady peace maintains between the two, and the cultures of both England and Scotland remain alive in the borderlands, with many citizens intermarrying the communities. The Whiteleys have a group of hunter-scavengers who venture north and south in search of supplies to keep the settlement running. They do maintain a level of morality. For example, they won't rob or hurt a lone mother struggling along with her child, but they probably won't help her either. A larger group, however, especially of men, is absolutely fair game, and they are very professional at getting the job done. Stumble into the Whiteleys territory, you need to obey the rules. If not, you'll be hung on the border, as the death penalty is the main premise of this settlement. The Isle of Man. The Isle of Man dealt with the fallout drifting across their lands from Northern Ireland, Northern England and Scotland, causing many deaths in the early parts of the war. However, the few thousand who managed to tough it out inherited an island untouched by the bombs, and thus a civilization upon the island was able to be built once more. Although centered around Douglas, the people of the island spread across the entire face of it, managing to find small, untouched hamlets to live in relative peace. Due to the relative untouched nature of the island, the Manx and British identity has yet remained, although again, altered slightly due to the nature of the war. Many Manx people attempted ventures across the seas to Ireland and the mainland of Britain to make contact with others, however many didn't return, leading the leaders of the island to create a closed-shop policy. Occasionally, refugee ships will arrive on their shores. They will either immediately be turned away or killed on sight. They have ample farmland, fresh water, and lots of space. They won't risk losing it for anyone. The Orange Order. Clinging to life in the remnants of Armagh and Belfast sits an ultra-nationalist group of British loyalist survivors. Scarred by the bombs dropped upon Belfast, the people felt helpless and lost after the war. Then, men from the Republic of Ireland moved in an attempt to help those in the north. Buoyed by this, the loyalist population of Northern Ireland rallied, seeing this as an attempt to annex their home during their hardest hour. Instead of accepting help, they fought viciously in the nuclear ruins, many dying from the radiation exposure. With that said radiation starting to spread, as well as the open hostility of the area, the Republic occupied a horseshoe of territory from Ballycastle down through Dungannon, around Armagh and into Newry, sealing off the rest of the north with armed guards. Republicans in the occupied area fled to the border, but with no knowledge of who was who, they were denied entry. The Orange Order, behind a crowned orange cross with a black background, soon found its way into existence, raiding and pillaging the lands of the north, holding their core belief that their territory is going to be annexed. 20 years on, they still feel this way. A battered and warlike people, Their communities are martial and militarized. Everyone gears for the return of the Republic. Whether they do, however, is unknown. One thing is for certain: if you cross into the Orange Lands, you do not come back. The United Communes of Yorkshire and Merseyside. A collection of communist-inspired states, the UCYM is a militant alliance between survivors in and around the nuclear hellscape of Liverpool and the various ruined cities across Yorkshire. Initially, the pair clashed, attempting to retrieve supplies from different cache locations revealed after the war. However, eventually, the conflict drew to a stalemate. In a desperate attempt to obtain the supplies, the Scousers decided to make contact with a group called the Devillers, a rough and ready scavenger group operating within the remnant of Manchester. In response, the various Yorkshire settlements mistakenly allied themselves with a cannibalistic group called the Thorns. Once the clash started again, the Thorns and the Devillers showed no interest in aiding their chosen sides, instead raiding and abusing their way through the Yorkshire and Merseyside lands. Before long, a truce was made between Merseyside and Yorkshire, and they found themselves fighting off the scavenger mercenaries they'd hired to help. Their backs to the wall led them to believe they could accomplish more together, and thus they shared the caches of resources, and over the years they stood together before formally declaring the UCYM 10 years ago. Still subject to raider attacks, they now stand ready to defend their lands and bring about their viewed communist utopia in the ashes of northern and middle England. The Sherwood Foresters. Initially, the Sherwood Foresters were formed by the remnants of a Mercian military unit stationed in Nottingham. When the city was devastated by the bombs, many of the military personnel, realizing they were unable to aid the civilians above ground, hid in numerous cave systems beneath the city, where they encountered hundreds of civilians bundled up together. Over time, a wartime spirit developed amongst the civilians and the soldiers, similar to the Blitz spirit from World War II, and thus, when they once again emerged onto the surface of the now destroyed Nottingham, they were not disheartened. They thought to keep calm and carry on. Scavenging what they could from the city, they ventured out into the local countryside, eventually settling within Sherwood Forest itself. Over the years, the forest was transformed into a safe haven for loose survivors wandering the country, looking for a place to call home. This wasn't without its problems, however, as many bandits and nefarious characters slipped through the cracks, causing havoc from within. Due to this, the military unit decided the citizens had to be trained, had to defend themselves, and thus they were. Surrounded by trees, each citizen eventually crafted their own bow, and like the stories of Robin Hood himself, Sherwood Forest became littered with the rebels of England, hoping to defend the downtrodden. 20 years on, it still holds strong. Although the target of many vicious raider attacks, despite this, the civilians have become proficient archers over the years, and it will take some force to bring down the Foresters. Skeg Vegas. A hotbed of gambling and general degeneracy, Skeg Vegas is where those who don't fit in at an ordinary settlement end up. With remnants of power still remaining, the slot machines across the area still run, and people gamble away useless currency in an attempt to reawaken the former seaside joy of old England. Based in the ruins of a collapsed roller coaster, a cabal of mafia-like leaders govern the territory, dragging everyone and anyone through the mud as they go. They extract everything they can from the downtrodden before tossing them to the wayside, but at least they have fun before the end. Skeg Vegas is somewhere you never want to end up. But for some reason, survivors just keep flocking there. And so it keeps growing and growing. The Ashlands. The Ashlands sit in the heart of the Black Country, balancing between the destroyed hellscapes of Birmingham and Wolverhampton. An horrific area to find yourself in, the Ashlands is a lawless pit of every kind of hedonistic behavior imaginable, from cannibals to toughs dead set on living the high life. Despite the nation's destruction, the Ashlands hold any and every kind of person. However, if you want a civilized existence, it is not here. Families will be torn apart, children will be taken, wives will be abused. This is a no-go zone for anyone with a modicum of civilization left in their bones. Firearms are widespread, as are knives, swords, axes, sledgehammers, even explosives. Many here are brutally deformed by the radiation, others are completely mentally inept, the product of both radioactivity but also after-war inbreeding. Once part of the beating heart of the United Kingdom, what was the Black Country has been poisoned and defiled by first the bombs and then the insanity afterwards. Stay away from here. New Cymru. New Cymru is an attempt to re-establish Wales as a nation despite the devastation the war caused to the south. Based in Newton, Welsh Rangers on horseback trek in all directions, spreading the word to Welsh survivors of the nation's rebirth under Welsh nationalism. Under an agricultural revitalisation, the group aimed to be self-sufficient, similar to the Isle of Man, but also completely shut off from the rest of the United Kingdom. They face a tough task, however, as raiders from the Ashlands venture regularly into Welsh territory, skirmishing with Cymru guards. An attempt is planned to scavenge the radiated cities of Swansea and Cardiff in order to retrieve crucial supplies and information that could aid in Welsh unification. However, without real proper hazmat suits, this will still prove to be a death sentence to those embarking on the journey. An alliance is currently being discussed with emissaries from the Sherwood Foresters that would see a joint attack and occupation of the Ashlands to limit their spread throughout the nation. However, reluctant to extend the hand of friendship outside of Wales, an answer currently hasn't been returned. The New British Legion. The New British Legion are a tyrannical, authoritarian regime based around the outskirts of the former capital of London. Made up of surviving political figures and royalty from before the war who had specifically prepared bunkers and shelters made well before the bombs dropped, accompanied by a loyal military personnel including functioning air support and armoured vehicles with sufficient and available fuel. They wish to reunite the nation as the United Kingdom once more. However, they have not once sent a diplomatic overture to any settlement around them. They have rolled over several small settlements in their area, forcefully assimilating them into the Legion. Clad in black, the Legion claims to represent the morals of Old Britain and also claims to be the legitimate successor state. By far the most populous in terms of citizens, the totalitarian state has dystopian breeding rules in place in order to repopulate the nation, as well as mandatory military service. Although the goal of reuniting the country seems honourable, the fledgling nation-states of the island of Britain will not fall under the imperial jackboot, and so crushing them may be the only answer. And that is an answer that the Legion are more than happy to provide. The Norfolk Freelands. The Norfolk Freelands is a collection of small cooperating settlements, villages, and towns, all living relatively peacefully side by side. Relying on a small military garrison provided by the Sherwood Foresters, the Freelands is an attempt to return to normalcy by reigniting the close-knit community feeling which encapsulated Old England. Completely disarmed, the area relies on its trust of its citizens to want to rediscover the old ways, and thus many scientific expeditions have been lodged into ruined libraries and ex-government buildings in an attempt to obtain information, schematics, and plans on how to rebuild the old world. Despite the presence of the Foresters as a defense force, they are largely a token addition, and if a real, dedicated military force like the Legion decided to attack the Freelands, they would be completely exposed, and with only a small strip of land connecting them to the territory of the Foresters, they would also find themselves quickly and efficiently cut off from their only ally. As of yet, no one has attempted an attack, and so the largely pacifist area of the nation currently carries on in its mission to restore the infrastructure of the country completely peacefully. For now. The Despots of Dover. The Despots of Dover, sometimes called the Peelers, are an horrific group of torturous beings inhabiting the cliffs of Dover and the surrounding areas of the southern coast of Britain. Despite their relatively small number, the despots create a real scene, butchering anyone and everyone who enters their territory. They enjoy the practice of flaying, hence the name the Peelers, as well as any sadistic method of inflicting pain upon someone. Over the past 20 years, boats full of French refugees fleeing across the Channel to see if Britain holds better conditions have fallen into the hands of the Peelers, and thus have discovered very quickly that there is always something worse. Mentally broken by the aftermath of the war, the Peelers paint themselves in a similar fashion to the old Celtic Britons in an attempt to mentally torture those who they find. Several clashes between the Legion and the Despots have broken out over the past few years, proving that although the Legion may be horrible authoritarian control freaks, they probably aren't that bad when you really dive into it. The Despots are the worst of the worst, encompassing old tribal ways, worshipping new and suspiciously demonic gods and spirits, as well as practicing ritual human sacrifice and committing barbaric acts of cannibalism. These hellspawn make the Aztecs look extremely civil. The Isle of Wight. The Isle of Wight, similar to the Isle of Man, suffered from fallout drifting not just from the British mainland, but also northern France. Thus a lot of citizens did succumb to the radiation. In the years post-war, a majority of native Isle of Wight citizens moved on to the mainland in an attempt to find food and supplies, leaving the island virtually empty. Skip forward a few years, and people began to move back, looking to avoid the furor of the mainland. Very few people populate the Isle of Wight now, but those who do stick to their own covens, of a few dozen here and there, hoping no big raiding party from the mainland decides to venture out to their island. Similar to Norfolk, the Isle of Wight wishes to rebuild some form of normalcy, a part of the old world once more. But with such a small population, that seems an extremely hard task. The Second Kingdom of Wessex. Stretching from the nuclear wastelands of Southampton and Portsmouth, deep into Cheltenham and to the Welsh border, and then down to Plymouth and Bude, the Second Kingdom of Wessex is a feudal state of lands, ruled by a newly instated monarchy. Based upon the ancient kingdom of Alfred the Great, Wessex acts as a protector state for Cornwall, with a respectable population in relation to the other major settlements. Wessex is also heavily militarized, with several long scrap borders along its northern territories with neighboring states. Always open to engage in diplomacy, the Second Kingdom of Wessex has had emissaries from the Foresters, New Cymru, Norfolk, and even as far north as the Highlanders. Although the legend states that Wessex is a pretender state which is seeking to crown the UK its own. Despite the rhetoric, Wessex does worry about an all-out attack from the new British Legion, as their functioning armoured vehicles and handful of jets would prove a real issue for the relatively primitive scattered rifles, bows and swords of the fledgling kingdom. Regardless of that, Wessex will defend itself, and Cornwall if it must, but would hope that its diplomatic overtures weren't squandered in its hour of need. Cornwall. Cornwall is the isolated southern tip of mainland Britain, and home to a population of majority war survivors. The elderly call the Cornish coast home en masse, whilst many middle-aged war survivors and veterans flocked down there after the bombs finally stopped falling. Despite its small size and stature, due to the sheer amount of people who rushed there for safe harbour after the bombs, the population is comparable with its much larger neighbour Wessex, and thus an in-depth defensive plan has been devised in the case of an attack. Despite these plans though, those in Cornwall now just aim to live a peaceful and self-sufficient life away from radiation, death and devastation. To sit and watch the waves roll in on their incredibly beautiful beaches. Let's hope it lasts. At this point, decades after the collapse of the nation, completely cut off from all outside interference and with an absolutely minuscule population, the former United Kingdom sits on a knife edge. Very easily, the remaining survivors could encounter dangers, dwindling the numbers even further to the point of complete extinction in the British Isles of any and all form of human life, relegating the land to a dangerous and hostile no-go zone for survivors across the European continent. Maybe, instead of this, those groups managed to form some kind of stable peace, built upon the morals and accomplishments of their forefathers. Not exactly rebuilding Britain, but igniting the embers of a new civilization on the island. Or maybe option 3. They war. They war with each other over dwindling resources, over relatively safe land, over people and animals, buildings and schematics. They war until one by one the groups fall, leaving a sole ruler of the island left to carve the future of Britain in their own image, for better or for worse. What would happen from here? Well, that's purely hypothetical. This situation is so far out of the realms of possibility in our minds that any guesswork of the future from here on out would be just that, guesswork. But I did say I want to study and delve into aftermaths, and so this may not be the end. If anyone watching this wants to see me dive deeper, even deeper, into the future of this world, please let me know through subscribing to my channel, liking this video, and commenting what you believe might happen. This video is a trial of new content. I'd love to make YouTube a full-time thing in the future, and I hope videos like this are the catalyst towards that goal. Before I end, I do want to say, although huge amounts of research went into this video, We still genuinely have no idea just what will happen after a cataclysm like a nuclear war. We may all perish within minutes, or our leaders may grow a conscience and limit the exchange to a few bombs, leading us down a fragile, peaceful path that could shatter at any moment. But we don't know. So take everything I've theorized here and everything I've created with a grain of salt. You may disagree, and that's absolutely fine. That's the great thing about alternate scenarios. Everyone will have a different interpretation of what could happen. But this is mine, and I'm eager to build on not just this scenario, but many others. So if you want to see what I think the UK would look like after other types of disasters, leave them in the comments. I'll do my best to get around to them all. Hopefully you'll all be back for the future, for different uploads, and we can form a community on this channel of like-minded, disaster-loving freaks like myself. But anyways, cheers everyone, have a good day, and I'll catch you all next time. Bye bye.